Good morning. How are you? Happy birthday to my country. I want to give you morning rounds on a topic that I covered yesterday, but that needs to be addressed again today. And that has to do with whether or not the current COVID vaccines are effective against the Delta variant. Yesterday, I discussed with you a paper published in Cell that indicated that, at least in laboratory tests, the present vaccines would in fact protect against the Delta variant. But let's see what happens out there in the streets, as it were, because what happens in the laboratory is not always entirely recapitulated in what we see clinically. Let's look at what's happening in Israel as an example of what could possibly happen here in this country. There has been a surge of new cases of COVID in Israel. 95% of them are of the Delta variant. The number of new cases in Israel has tripled in the past 10 days. In June 25th issue of the Wall Street Journal, they reported that half of the new cases of the Delta variant were taking place in patients who had been fully vaccinated with an mRNA vaccine. Half of the new cases of COVID in Israel are being diagnosed in patients who have been fully vaccinated with an mRNA vaccine. 94% of the patients in Israel with COVID who are deemed serious cases are either in critical care units or on ventilators. 94%. We're going to need a bigger boat. I think that it's clear, at least in clinical experience now in Israel, and we will soon discover what the cases look like in the UK, which is experiencing a surge, and I expect here in this country. We will soon understand the extent to which these vaccines protect against the Delta variant outside of the lab, in the clinics, in the hospitals. I am of the opinion that although vaccination was conceived as a smart and effective intervention to address the COVID pandemic, when I say we're going to need a bigger boat, I think we need treatment. And I think we need better treatment than we had last year. We've got 18 months of experience treating patients with COVID. I think there are a lot of lessons that we have learned about how to best treat these patients and what medications can be used or can be tried to have a better outcome than we had last year. In order to give you a kind of analogy, my favorite, of what I think we're dealing with here, I think we're dealing with COVID, with SARS-CoV-2. I think we're dealing with the viral version of the greatest horse of all time, which was Secretariat. When Secretariat won the Kentucky Derby, the horse won clearly, but not by a lot. When Secretariat ran the Preakness, it was pretty deliberate, distinct win. Secretariat was certainly the winner. You need to watch the Belmont. 1973, the Belmont Stakes. Secretariat is in the number one post. Around the back stretch, the announcer describes Secretariat pulling ahead pretty dramatically as a tremendous running machine. And at that point, I think Secretariat was only maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 lengths ahead. Secretariat finishes the race 25 lengths ahead of the horse in back of him, who's in front of the rest of the crowd in back of that horse. What's interesting, the announcer doesn't say this, but I happen to know this, Secretariat, magnificent animal, was accelerating at every marker. So every marker that they sort of clocked him at, the horse was accelerating, going faster. It's a 1.5 mile track. Every time they clocked Secretariat, the horse was running faster. The horse crossed the finish line 25 lengths ahead and was still accelerating. I mean, I don't even think the F-18As do that. Maybe they do. Some pilot can let me know. But I mean, our jet pilots, are they continuing to accelerate? Probably they are. So is Secretariat. My concern is that we've got SARS-CoV-2 hoping to win by 25 lengths. It's very hard to catch up with that horse, okay? It's very hard to catch up with SARS-CoV-2 by trying to outrun it with vaccines. We're going to need treatment. Let's figure out what the treatment is. And I understand that we, normally rely on randomized, controlled trials, prospective, blinded, the whole bit. Yeah, right. But we've got a pandemic, and we were able to roll out vaccines, right? That normally take 10 years. If you want to do randomized, controlled studies and so on and so forth, 10 years for a vaccine. We got them out in 6 months. Why? Because there was a pandemic. It was an emergency. Guess what, folks? It's still a pandemic. It's still an emergency. And I think it's probably not wise to continue to hold fast to 2 standards. Randomized controlled studies, that take maybe 4 years, take 3 years to get underway and 4 years to assess with regard to treatments that might actually be on the shelf and be very effective. Or just roll out the vaccines, in 6 months because it's an emergency. It's an emergency. It's a pandemic. It applies across the board to vaccines, if you want to argue it that way, and to medications as well. And I think we need medications that perhaps don't cost $3,000, okay? Maybe there's something there in the pharmacy that might be less expensive that, under the present circumstances, should be evaluated and implemented, as long as they're not hazardous. I'm not suggesting that we just pull anything off the shelf, but go back there, in the supply closet. I think there's some things back there that might be useful. In any case, happy birthday to this country, and especially thank you to our servicemen. Thank you to our founding fathers. We owe them a lot. They were very brave. Very brave. They took on tyranny, and that's a piece of work, to take on tyranny. So until I see you again, remember the 2 best medicines are love and mercy. And until then, God bless.